appreciate it. This is kind of an interesting talk. It's a different talk. So many times in history, it's bad and it's wars and it's about presidents and governors and kings and queens. But there's a lot of other history out there, and it doesn't have to be all miserable. It can be really fun and entertaining. And I like doing fun and kind of different things on Florida history. And so one thing about these utopian societies is they usually have a charismatic leader, like that guy who just walked by in the blue shirt. As you can see from here, they all have some type of a charismatic leader. Now, how did I get into this? So I had this idea because I stumbled across a couple of utopian societies online, most likely. I said, boy, that would be a really cool book, because I started to realize there's a lot of them. And then I went online to see, and of course somebody had already beat me to the punch and wrote a really good book on utopian societies. So it's kind of like the Bible on utopian historic societies in Florida. And it's called Utopian Communities, and it's really, really good. Now, I've added a couple of my own that are not in the book. Can't cover all of them. There are so many of them. They cover almost all parts of the state as well. So we will cover some of them, and even the Turnbull colony here is in some way considered a utopian colony or utopian society for its time, not so much in the way we see it today in the the 20th, 19th, and 18th century. But back then, it kind of was considered a utopian colony. So we're going to kind of get into this fun history. Some of these could be an hour lecture on their own. I'm going to try to give you a nice gloss in like 45 minutes. And some of these you may know, and some of these you may not know. But as I said, charismatic leader. And when the charismatic leader dies, guess what happens? It usually crumbles, right? Yeah, it usually falls apart. So some of these are really, really interesting. So I'm going to show you one. I think if you know Florida, you've lived here a while, and you know the, let's say, the region, this one may be a little shocking to you. Palatka. Now, how many of you have been to Palatka? At least at some point. Okay, good. So Palatka was not originally called Palatka. It was called Rollstown. So I want you to meet this guy, Dennis Roll. So Dennis Roll was a kook. He was a megalomaniac. He loved farm work. He hated alehouses. He was against cockfighting. He was litigious. And this story goes way back to 1763 when the British took over Florida for 20 years. And what the British decided to do was to take Florida and divide it into half. East Florida, with the capital of St. Augustine, was the 13th royal colony, was the 14th royal colony. And then West Florida was Pensacola, that's the capital, the 15th royal colony. So at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, how many colonies did we have? 5, 10, 15. The winners write history, right? So the thing is that Florida was a Tory, these are Tory colonies, so this kind of became a haven for people who were fleeing the colonies of the Revolutionary War. And then it went back to Spain. But originally, at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, there were 15 royal colonies. But you don't hear about that, because maybe just because it was Florida. I don't know. Florida's a kooky place. It's crazy. I mean, some of these stories are like, can this be real? Well, anyway, Palatka was a utopian society called Rollstown. It had a kind of a salacious nickname. The locals called it, in the region, Crackertown. So what Dennis Roll tried to do is that what the British were doing were giving away these generous land grants. And they're trying to create a plantation economy in East Florida and West Florida, like Ormond and Oswald and Turnbull, and that way they can generate this plantation economy. And he was one of the benefactors of this because he petitioned for one, and basically was given 80,000 acres, what is today Palatka. And back then there was a reform and transport movement where he would take like, let's see, pickpockets, homeless people, thieves, drunkards, prostitutes, and transport them here, and then they could be reformed, and they would be indentured servants, and they would have this huge plantation economy. And of course, after 7 years or so, they would be reformed, and they would be released, and they could have their own life here. The problem is that the minute they got to the Palatka area and saw that place, they all left. Some of this is going to be funny, I will tell you that. I'm a big fan of history comedy, believe it or not. So it was basically a colony of poor persons. So the governor, Grant, he hated this idea because he thought it brought in this horrible seedy element into the area, and he didn't like that at all. So already there's this conflict going. And Dennis Rolls was a real kooky guy. He decided that St. Augustine was a very immoral place, that his indentured servants cannot go there, but he could go there, and he actually had a home there. So it wasn't good for his indentured servants, but it was okay for him. So the governor, Grant, was upset because they were bringing in misfits, and that they would not really be able to contribute to the economy of East Florida. And what ended up happening is that, and absolutely really nothing did happen, because most of the people fled, and then he replaced them with about 200 African slaves. That's what he did. And by the end of this utopian society where everybody would be reformed and have their own plots of land and they'd have ownership, at the very end, in around 1780 or so, 81, when the British were ready to leave, there was 3 people left living on like a tent on the St. Johns River, because Palatka is on the St. Johns River. So St. Augustine, a place of debauchery. Him and his wife could have a place there, and they could enjoy the debauchery, but none of his people could as well. So he brought in these. It was 23 miles and 6 miles wide. That was his grant for this Rolls town. Now, too large even for 1,000 slaves. He only had 600 acres under cultivation, and most of that ended up failing, was never a success. This basically was a failure, but he tried to create this utopian society for misfits, basically coming over from England, but it failed. What ended up happening is that when the Revolutionary War broke out, he fled to Exuma, and he started a slave plantation in the Bahamas, Exuma. And his name, Rolls, R-O-L-L-E, died out. Now there are some one famous person, most of the men might know this, who are descendant of that slave plantation, Antoine Roll, who was a Florida State defensive back, who played for the Minnesota Vikings and was really a great player, is actually a descendant of basically Dennis Rolls. His name has died out, but it survives in the Bahamas. So the Huguenots have come back. You may not have heard this story. If you know anything about Florida history, you know that the French tried to settle the southeast, and they had this Fort Caroline, and they tried to have this Huguenot settlement on the St. Johns River, about 5 miles up the river. And then, one of the great conquistadors of Spain came, Pedro Menendez, and he came there to kill them, not because they were French, but because they were heretics. And he basically slaughtered all of them at Matanzas, we see where Fort Matanzas is today. Those are the Huguenots. So the Huguenots, or Huguenots, depending on how you want to pronounce it, were always trying to escape persecution. And so in the same time period, 1763 to 1783, the Edict of Nantes, and Protestantism is basically kind of outlawed, and they're being heavily persecuted. There's another attempt of basically French Huguenots that are living in England that are now going to try to settle West Florida on the other side. So we have East Florida with the French back in 1563, and then now we're going to have this kind of utopian society of these French Huguenots that are going to find a settlement 6 miles north of Pensacola on the Escambia River. And again, of course, this is a really interesting story, and this really involves archaeology, and they don't really know exactly where this town was. But they petitioned a land grant for these French Huguenots, some 60 to 300, they don't really know, that they would be given land in West Florida. The Governor Montfort Brown, and Governor Johnstone would find suitable land for them. But you know, Florida's really not a very good place to grow crops. There are certain things that grow well, like watermelon can grow and some corn, but it's not the best place, right? Because it's very sandy. So anyway, somewhere between 600 and 300 of these French Huguenots come over, and Lord Halifax, George Montauk Dunk, granted the land grant. Now, the Halifax River is named after him. So thank God they named it the Halifax River and not his last name, like the Dunk River. That would have been really bad. Yeah, where do you live? I live on the Dunk River. That sounds polluted. But anyway, so Campbelltown is in 1770. They come over on a ship called the Red Hat Galley. They leave Cork and with these Huguenots, and they're led by a reverend or a minister, and his name is Levelier, and he's known as a really good man, high moral character, honest guy, and immediately the British had such high hopes for this guy, but then when they checked the register that he gave of the people who were supposed to be on the ship and who were actually on the ship, it didn't jive. So now all of a sudden they're like, oh, what's going on with this guy? So immediately they set sail, and immediately he's complaining about his food that he's getting on the ship and his accommodations on the Red Hat Galley as they make their journey over. Once they get to Hispaniola to kind of restock, some of the Huguenots desert and they go AWOL and they leave and never seen again. But they finally make their way to Pensacola, and they are taken up to where this new settlement of Campbelltown, and they're going to grow silkworms, and they're going to go grapevine and make wine, and they can sell that in Pensacola and the surrounding areas. This is still a very dangerous place, especially because of the Native Americans and the disease and the heat. And here's a big problem. They were to be given provisions and tools, and they were paid to have some of these plots. Well, guess what never arrived? The provisions and the tools never arrived. So that was a big problem. So they finally are sent out into the hinterlands north of Pensacola, into Native American territory, and they begin to set up their settlement, but they're sent with a small regiment of soldiers, a sergeant and 12 soldiers from the 31st Regiment to protect them. And we don't know how many homes were built. We don't know exactly how many buildings or the exact location of it. But maybe someday archaeologists will be able to find that. So the colony really never survived for very long. And what ends up happening is that, there's in Pensacola, there's an assembly. And every year they would send somebody from the assembly. But eventually, as time gone on, and you had the assembly in Pensacola, everybody's like, where are the people from Campbelltown? Not showing up. They never showed up. Even that guy, Levelier, the Reverend, after 6 months, he abandoned the colony and went and lived in Pensacola. So he was not very thrilled about what was going on in Campbelltown. What ends up happening is that eventually these people disappear. Lost colony, gone. Nobody knows what happened. Did they die from disease? Were they picked up by the Native Americans? Nobody knows. So this is really kind of an interesting story that is not really well known at all. Have you ever heard of the state of Muskogee? So there is a guy named William Augustus Bowles. He's 12 years old. He's charismatic. Even at 12 years old, we've met 12-year-olds who are very charismatic, right? Big personalities. This is definitely one of those guys. He is a Tory. He loves England. And he doesn't like what's going on in the colony, so he walks from Maryland to Pensacola to join the British Army in the defense of Pensacola. Well, he's kind of a rebel as well, and he gets into an argument a couple of years later when he's like 15, and he's ousted from the British military, and he begins to walk back to Maryland, and he gets picked up by the Creeks and the Seminoles, and he's taken into the tribe. He learns the language, and he marries the daughter of a very prestigious chief named Chief Perryman. And his idea is that he is going to take Florida and make it a haven and a refuge for southern tribes. But he would be the self-appointed king. He's also a white guy too, right? I mean, so he is made a chief, but he's like a minor chief, right? He had the support of Chief Mikazuki as well. Now, who buys into a lot of this vision of creating this, southern refuge, this southern utopian society where it's just, it's the Creeks, it's some of the Choctaws and the Cherokees, it's a lot of the young warriors. So he has a lot of influence with the young warriors. So he's a really interesting guy. Now he very educated, very intelligent. He wrote his own biography. He could paint. He did music. He even did a stint in New York at one point in his life as a comedian. I didn't even know they had comedians back then. I don't know what that means. Maybe he was an actor comedian. I don't know. I think they had stand-up back then. So really interesting guy. But he's a real rebel rouser. And he really is going to cause a lot of problems for the Spanish, because when the Spanish come back, after the British are kicked out, they are really weak in power. They basically only have a token military here. And so there's a lot of border skirmishes going on, a lot of raiding, a lot of slaves are escaping down here. The Black Seminoles live. It's a huge story. So this is a very interesting guy. So he was an adventurer, pirate as well. So he decided that he was going to create this state of Muskegee. He had 3 ships that would attack the Spanish shipping. It had its own flag, and he would basically wrestle Florida away from Spain. He basically declared war on everybody. He declared war on Spain, he declared war on the United States, and basically didn't want Britain involved either. It's an interesting story because history is so connected. We learned it on a timeline that this happened here, and then this happened, and then this happened. History is big, and it kind of goes back to this trading firm that the British had brought in here called Panton and Leslie. Panton and Leslie had their headquarters in St. Augustine, and they had a monopoly on trading, sort of like Amazon does today. They have a monopoly on trading on the internet, goods and services, right? So what ends up happening is he wants a piece of that pie because he wants the Seminoles and these southern tribes to be able to trade and break that monopoly that Panton and Leslie has. So he attacks a bunch of their storehouses and all that stuff. And now he's in cahoots with a governor in the Bahamas, and they want some of their goods, so they're trying to muscle their way in. It's basically everybody's trying to out-hustle each other. So what he does is he attacks this big fort. I bet you don't know this. There's a sister fort to the one in St. Augustine in Appalachia, 19 miles south of Tallahassee. You take Monroe Street, which is the main north-south drive, and you just keep going to dead ends in the Castillo de San Marcos de Appalachia on the St. Marks River. And it's a state park. And he attacked that fort. And he got his young warriors together because he's trying to wrestle Florida away, La Florida away, to create this unique utopian society for southern tribes. And what he did with these warriors is very unusual. He conducted siege warfare. Native Americans didn't do siege warfare. That's European stuff. But he basically taught them how to do that. And they did that on that fort. And basically the Spanish gave up this fort. It was a horrible humiliation. So this gained him a lot of momentum and a lot of support in there. So he's really wrestling up a lot of problems for Spain and for the United States as well. Plus now he's trying to bring in another trading firm, another English trading firm from the Bahamas. So a real tough guy. Matter of fact, the Spain hates him so much, and they want him so bad that they put out they will put out a bounty on his head. You know what they'll pay you if you capture? If you capture Augustus Bowles, or you capture Augustus Bowles, or you capture Augustus Bowles, they will give you 1,500 kegs of rum. That might be worth a good bounty. He's captured eventually, and he's sent to he's basically in prison. But then he's transferred on a ship to another prison. He escapes, takes over the ship, comes back, sails back to Pensacola. I'm back to establish my state of Muskegee again. And so they're like, oh my, this guy's crazy. So There's a whole book written on it like that thick. That's the exploits of this gentleman, this adventurer. Here is the Castillo San Marcos. Now that's not what it really looked like. I mean, there's a whole history of this fort. But anyway, he was going to be the commander-in-chief and director. There's his flag. So that's one of the flags. That flag was raised over that fort. And you can go see that fort today. If you're ever in the area, it's a very peaceful place. It's a very historic place. God save the state of Muskogee. That was his slogan. Well, what ends up happening in a nutshell is that the Spain puts together this huge armada out of Louisiana, New Orleans, and they're like, we're taking back that fort. And they come and they take the fort back. He flees to his headquarters, which is a place called Lake Miccosukee. Anybody ever been there? It's east of Tallahassee. It's very beautiful. That's his town. Spanish send out a force to try to find him. They can't find him. They don't know where this Lake Miccosukee is. They come back. He tries to take the fort a third time, but fails. He's now lost his credibility and disrespected that he failed to take this fort that he so easily took. And now he's losing support. He goes to a conference of some of these southern tribes that are coming together, and he's betrayed there, and he's put in handcuffs, and he is taken prisoner by the Spanish, and he's put into the El Moro Castle in Havana, where nobody escapes. And he's ever seen from the beginning. He dies there a few years later. So it's a very interesting story. You can go and buy that book on Amazon as well. That Utopian book is on Amazon as well. So anyway, there's Seminoles. Spain had minimal control. How many of you been to Micanopy?
Yes, it looks like
Did you know Micanopy was a utopian society? It was a Jewish utopian society, the first in North America. Quite amazing. And there is a state marker out there that tells you about that. It's in that little central area. If you've not been to Micanopy, it's a great place to go off the beaten path. And if you go, take State Road 40. Do not get on the interstate I-75, although you can get there that way. But there's nothing on the interstate but interstate. If you go up 441, you'll go through the horse country. You'll go through the Victorian town of McIntosh, and then you'll come up to Miccosukee, the cutest town in Florida maybe, but it's tiny. It was a trading post called Wanton originally, and this gentleman here named Moses Levy, he's from Morocco. He was a timber dealer in the Caribbean, basically in and around St. Thomas, and he became very, very wealthy. He had to leave Morocco and went to Spain, where they basically were called Sephardic Jews. And because of the persecution from the Muslims in Morocco, that's where he fled, came to the United States, and he believed that Jewish people in Europe who were being persecuted, think about that, ubiquitous, how long has that been going on? So he basically wants to set up a refuge in the middle of nowhere, Florida. He ends up getting about 100,000 acres eventually in Florida. And he's a slaver. He owns slave plantation, owns slaves, but he gets a change of mind, and he becomes an abolitionist. And he writes a book in London about abolishing slavery, and that it should be done gradually over time. Gradual abolition is what he believed in. And he believes that European Jews are being persecuted, have lost their way with the faith, and they've lost the traditional teachings. And he believed that they were doing things that were not dignified. They were peddlers, and he wanted them to get back to the land. A lot of these movements are back to the land movements, back to agrarian principles. And that's what this was. So he was going to set up a place called Pilgrimage Plantation, which is today's Micanopy. Micanopy did not live there. Chief Micanopy did not live there. He lived in Somerville, south of that. And this is going to be a refuge. So he creates, he has some New York investors, and he creates this sugar plantation. One of the things that these pilgrims are going to do, not many came, I mean maybe 50, maybe 100 came, is that they were going to have to build their own road to get their crops to the St. Johns River. Why the St. Johns River? That's the main highway. That's the infrastructure. There's no railroads back then in the 1830s. And so can you imagine hacking a road from basically just south of Gainesville to Volusia, where Astor is, and you go over like that's where that was a main trading post there, Volusia, the Volusia Landing. And I don't know if that road ever happened, but what ended up happening is that the Seminole War basically destroyed. He put $18,000 of his own money into this operation, and he didn't have. It was not a success. The Seminole War happened. The second Seminole War happened. First one happened in North Florida mostly. Second one in Central Florida here. Lots of activity here. And then the third one was mainly in the Everglades. But so that is Moses Levy. And then here it is. So Micanopy, right there. There's Cross Creek, Payne's Prairie, and then there's Gainesville. So there's McIntosh. If you like to go 90 miles an hour, you can get on 75, but you're going to miss all the beauty. You'll miss old Florida if you do that. I love old Florida, and so that's really cool. So really, really great. There's so many cool things to see in Alachua County, by the way. I'm writing a book called Off the Beaten Path in Northeast Florida, not finished. And man, is there a lot of stuff in Alachua County. Everything's based on a 2-hour drive from basically here. So, a day drive. He had a son. Moses Levy had a son named David Yulee, who changed his name. And he was called the Firebrand because, unlike his dad, he was so pro-slavery. His dad is an abolitionist now. His son is this crazed pro-slavery guy with plantations, and he was the first Jewish U.S. senator, and they called him like the firebrand of Florida because he was so pro-slavery. He built the first railroad. He's called the father of the Florida railroads because he built the first railroad from Cedar Key, incredible place if it's still there, and all the way up to Fernandina. Because the hurricane rolled over Cedar Key. I love Cedar Key. If you've not been, you got to go. And truly old Florida. And so here's now his son was recognized as a great Floridian and put into the History Hall of Fame basically. But he was a crazed racist. The dad tried to create a refuge for persecuted Jews in Europe, and he's the one that does not get into the great Floridian designation. This guy does. Yeah, okay, so he built a railroad. But he probably built it with slaves. It was built in the 1850s. So that's Senator David Yulee. So. And then there's the railroad. There's an earlier railroad from Tallahassee to St. Mark's that actually is earlier than that one. But it was pulled by animals. And then it terminates. There's the termination right there. There's Cedar Key, 6 miles out in the Gulf. Talk about isolated. You know, hurricanes love to go over Cedar Key and then they back up, go over it again, and they go over it again, and they back up. It's crazy. Penny Farms. Anybody ever been to Penny Farms? Yeah. So, I remember as a child going to J.C. Penney, James Cash Penney to buy clothes. I always bought my first blazer there. And so he was a man of very strong faith. His parents were very, very religious. I think his dad may have been a minister as well. And he had a lot of energy, very smart guy. And he started to clerk and work in these kind of dry goods stores. Eventually he decided to open up his own store. And then, by 1902 he had like 800 stores. But what he did is he applied scientific management to his stores. So scientific management is something that happened in the Gilded Age, in the Industrial Revolution, 1865 to 1900, when everything was becoming mechanized. And, so scientific management is like, well, how many of these can I produce? But I got to move it from this station to that station. But the scientists will come and say, well, why not move it from that station to just there? And you can save time and be more productive. So it's basically industrial engineering, scientific management, applied to how can you be more efficient. Maybe you make your shovel a little bigger, the spade part bigger than smaller, and you can now shovel more coal and be more efficient. That's basically what it is. He applied that to this crazy agricultural experiment in Clay County, Florida, called Penny Farms. It's a retirement center today. But of course, he went on to be a super rich, wealthy guy. He ends up putting $40 million into this agricultural experiment. Now, he came to Florida for the same reasons that everybody else did. Vacation. And some people fell in love. Many of the artists that you might see in the C.C. and Hyatt Brown Museum, if you've been there, all came as tourists. They came on vacation. Some come for health reasons, some come for sportsman's paradise, and then some come because it's got warm weather. And he came because his health really was having some health problems. I think he was under a lot of stress. So he came and vacationed in 1912 and kind of liked Florida. But the agricultural thing, what's the idea that spawned this agricultural experiment? Well, see, he grew up on a farm in Missouri. He grew up on a farm. His parents were very religious, lots of kids, you know, like 10 siblings, something like that. And so this is a nostalgia kind of experiment for him. And so he's been experimenting with the scientific management, with cows and agriculture. And so why not go where there's cheap land? Well, used to be until like 2 years ago. Florida, right?
Yeah, right.
So, you know, they practically give away land in Florida at one point, you know. When I was in Tallahassee, I was a boy, you know, I was getting ready to graduate and say, you know, they got waterfront lots on the St. Marks River, which is this beautiful, crazy, prehistoric looking river, like the Tomoka River, the Spruce River, and they were selling these lots for like $1,500. Of course, the college kid didn't have $1,500, but it would have been a good investment. So he now moves the stores to this agricultural endeavor called Penny Farms in Clay County, near Green Cove Springs. He built his own kind of plantation house there. It's basically like a commune for all of these farmers to come and live there, and you share in the profits. It's a co-op, right? But even with these things, there's always a leader. It's almost like kind of like these quasi-communist things where what is mine, what is yours is also mine, right? This whole profit-sharing type of thing, right? And so that works really, really good for a while, and he basically buys this defunct company that was already there called Florida Farms and Industries Company for $400,000. And they cleared 20,000 acres, and each family, like if you were a farmer, you could come there, share in the profits. It all sounds great on paper. Well, a lot of that stuff sounds great on paper until you put it into practicality. You get 20 acres, and they would build a small home for you. Here's the kicker with the home. No running water, no electricity, right? And of course no air conditioning, right? If you don't want electricity, you might not have air conditioning. And then you also had to pay some upfront expenses as well. So, it wasn't necessarily, a cheap thing, but he did attract a whole bunch of what he called colonists to the Penny Farms to have this co-op. And they did okay. They did all right. They cleared streets, they cleared a lot, and they were doing pretty good. Here's an aerial view. Really kind of an interesting aerial view of Clay County. And then, of course, he was a religious man, so he built a church. What ends up happening to Penny Farms, and it's interesting too because he really tried to provide for these colonist agricultural farmers. He brought in the University of Florida, and they did education on seeds, and they did education on crop rotation, and they did education for the wives on home economics. All that, and it was like a whole training facility and a co-op sharing the profits. Never really very profitable. What ends up happening is his parents die, and he builds this kind of memorial center where other ministers who retire, who dedicated their lives for very low pay, that could be forgotten, that they could come here and retire here in Florida. And it becomes kind of its own monster. And what happens is that a lot of the farmers are now abandoning their farms and going and building all these buildings for these retired ministers who are now all starting to come down to this retirement center. Because they probably can make more money. And being a farmer is really hard. I own 7 acres in the land. I have 6 alpacas, 3 horses, 3 mini donkeys. It's a lot of work. And one of my horses leans on the fences. So fixing fences is terrible. So they build church, and they build a community center, and they build these homes with apartments on them. All these amenities that these retired ministers would need. They build a swimming pool. There's classes. And then, of course, what happens that wipes out so many people in Florida? The Great Depression. he ends up losing $40 million. He practically is broke. But through his stores, JCPenney rebuilds his wealth. He still has that asset, but he lost almost $40 million on this venture eventually. So here he is, growing up through the years. The Depression hit, and then he passes away. I don't know if that date looks wrong. I'm not sure what that date was. Well, let's move on. Casadega. How many of y'all been to Casadega? So if you know anything about spiritualists, they're not supposed to tell you the future. They tell you about your dead relatives. You speak to your dead relatives. Your mom or your dad or your great aunt, great uncle. They're not psychics that tell you, oh, you're never going to win the lottery, and you're going to drive your car into a sinkhole. You know, not that type of thing, right? So they are to talk to your dead relatives. There's a difference. Spiritualists at the camp who are certified supposed to talk to your dead relatives. So this incredible movement of like Jehovah Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists and the spiritualists all comes out of this area in western New York called the Burnt Over District, where it was still 1830s and 40s and 50s and 70s. It's a hotbed of religious activity, and a lot of these new sects and religions are coming out of that area. And that's where spiritualism started in New York. And so there's a guy named George P. Colby. He's 12 years old. He gets baptized in freezing water. After he gets baptized in freezing water, because his parents were Baptists, he now can talk to dead people. That's probably not what you want to hear from your 12-year-old. Hey, yeah, Mom, I can talk to like dead people. So he is a spiritualist. He has all these. He's a medium, and he's the type of guy that goes into a trance, and he's a trance medium. And he becomes kind of a leader in western New York at a place called Lake Casadega in New York, in western New York, of a camp called Dale Lilly Camp. Well, what's interesting is, why did this rise? Well, after the Civil War, 750,000 people died. So people could never see their loved ones again. Didn't get to say goodbye. And so this became popular as a way for people to maybe reconnect with their son or somebody who had died during the Civil War. And it kind of rose out of that. And it really becomes popular around 1900. So George P. Colby is a trance medium. He's in western New York there. He's kind of a leader of this group on Lake Casadega called the Dale Lilly Camp. There's a lot of these camps. And there were a lot of women involved in this as well, middle and upper middle class women. And two of them say, you need to find us a spiritualist camp in the South where it's really warm. And I can't remember their names. It's on the tip of my tongue. So he's led to Florida by a Native American spirit named Seneca. Seneca means water beneath the rocks, which is interesting because we have water beneath our rocks, right? You know, in the aquifer system, the Floridan aquifer. And so the spirit tells him, you need to go to this place where there's a Blue Springs. Well, there's a town called Blue Springs. It's called Orange City today. And so he gets on a steamboat, picks up another steamboat in Jacksonville. This is like 1878. And then he comes all the way up to Blue Springs Landing, which is called Blue Springs. That's the town. That's what it's called. And then the spirit guide leads him a little bit west into where Lake Helen would be, and he finds this area and a spirit lake. And that is where the Casadega is going to be laid down. But it doesn't happen immediately. And so what they do is eventually they do set up this spiritualist camp. It's called the psychic capital of the world today. People come from all over the world to go to it today. Unfortunately, my sister goes there a lot. But it's a whole other story. And so they build these buildings there. They build Harmony Hall. They build a lecture series there. And George P. Colby built his house there. He already owns like 1,000 acres. And they set up this camp of 35 acres and then eventually expands to 58 acres. And he's the tester. You have to take a test. You have to be a camp certified medium to be in this refuge for spiritualists. And if you don't pass the test, you're a charlatan. And you can't live in the camp. You have to live across the street. That's where they live today. Lots of postcards were made about this. They built a lot of these cottages. Now I'm the chairman of the Volusia County Historic Preservation Board. And so this town is in our jurisdiction. If it's in the county and not in the city limits, then it's our jurisdiction. And so what's happened over the years with these cottages they built is that they would replace windows with like jalousie windows, you know, and kind of these little Victorian cottages are being repaired in non-historic ways. So that's a big concern. And I drove through there the other day and it was looking a little rough. So here's the Spirit Lake that he was brought to for George Colby. The other thing that is interesting is there was these two, back to the emergence of these spiritualists, there's these two women named the Fox Sisters. One's Margaret, I can't remember the other one, but they're called the Fox Sisters. And they became a sensation in the Gilded Age, like the 1870s, 80s, because of that Civil War. And they attracted big audiences. And they would do this tapping sound, and they could talk to the spirits through tapping sounds. But in 1888, they came out and said it was all fake, that they were moving their joints, and that's where the snapping sound was coming. But even with that, there were still believers, right? People still believe in Loch Ness Monster, right? Even though they side scanned it, and okay? So they're still believers. And then it's kind of rose again. So he died on July 27th. You can go to Colby Park, and you can see the foundation ruins of his home. It's a beautiful park. They had a hotel there. There is still another hotel there today, the Casadega Inn. The original one was wooden, and it burned down. And so that's the replacement one in 1926. They got a nice restaurant. Here's the park that you can go to and go on this nice trail, and it's got historic markers. It's really, really nice. Koreshan Unity. 305 acres of kind of crazy. So this is a guy named Cyrus Tweed, if you want to call it. He wants to create in Estero, Florida, a city of 10 million people called New Jerusalem, basically is what it's going to be called, on the Estero River. Now this is again like in the Gilded Age, you know, when it's a frontier. I mean, Estero is like a little trading post. The closest town is Fort Myers. So this gentleman is like a self-proclaimed alchemist, metallurgist, and scientist, and psychologist, if you want to call him that. He experiments a lot with dangerous amounts of electricity in his lab. And whatever day it was or night it was, he got shocked the devil out of him, and he basically passed out, and a vision came to him of a female god and spoke to him and gave him the secrets of the universe. Yep. And what he basically said is that you, me, and everybody in here, we live in a hollow earth, and it's a concave, and that the sun is a reflection, and the whole universe is basically in this hollow sphere made of gold, and that's what we live in.
I like it already.
His number one characteristic is charisma. He has a lot of female followers as well. And most of the people that are going to make up his Koreshan Utopian society are women. Educated women, middle and upper class. Matter of fact, some women left their husbands to go be with him down in the middle of nowhere, Estero, Florida, at the turn of the century. Right before the turn of the century. It's basically a communist society. It's basically run on Marxist principles, which a lot of these are. And you give everything you own to him, but he will take care of you forever, and then you will live forever. And these 10 million people that are going to live in Estero, on the Estero River, will live forever. And then he's going to be basically the new Jesus Christ, is what he's basically predicted to be. And that he will resurrect when he dies. The problem is that when he resurrected, when he died, they put him in this zinc tub, and he was going to resurrect, and he never did. And after 8 days, the county authorities came in and buried him. It's hard to make this stuff up. If I can make it up, I'm a genius and I should be in Hollywood. That's when it was deeded to the state. Yeah, I'm going to get into that. So women, he was really a radical. This is very, very radical thought. Women had equality, they could vote. When they went down there he had all these crazy ideas. He found some support in Chicago at a mental health convention. They were so impressed with him that they elected him as president. And then eventually, what happens is when you have something this radical, you start to get backlash from the locals, right? And the locals don't like it. So even the locals and the people in Chicago, they were facing a lot of oppression because of this kind of crazy thing of hollow earth and living in a sphere, and the sphere's gold and the whole universe and all this and the seven planets are discs. And so a gentleman had attended his lecture, and he owned property in Estero and said, I'll sell you my land pretty cheap. And he ended up basically buying, thousands of acres on the Estero River to create this New Jerusalem in Florida. And everybody would live forever. But he's in charge, right? You give him all your stuff, but he's in charge. That's usually the way it was. What happens is a lot of the locals think that these communities that I've been talking about are just excuses for free love. So it's just not a 60s hippie thing. This goes way back in the Gilded Age. Oh, it's just a community for free love over there. And so you see a lot of that. This is, here's a really popular thing. To achieve the highest order, you would have to be celibate. That's
except the leader.
not that popular.
That's his face.
But 7 women were elected to run the administration of this, what's called Koreshan Unity. That's the philosophy, Koreshan Unity. It's a state park today. You can go and visit it as well. And they lived in this house. It was very, very nice. When they first went down to start this settlement, they lived in tents and outside for 2 years. So you're talking rattlesnakes, you got to clear thousands of acres, you got to grow crops. It was really quite an undertaking, but they did it. These were very fervent followers of Teed, Cyrus Teed, Koreshan. And what's amazing is that they brought in culture. But that's the thing about Florida. Cultures come into Florida from the north. Henry Flagler brought it. Henry Plant brought it. Some of these people brought it. You know what it's like. You get on I-95, you start going 95, and you cross the St. Mary's River, and you look back, I just left Florida, I'm in the south now. Even though we're southern by birth, culturally we're north, because a lot of it's been imported in. But back then, he's importing northern culture down in this really rural area. It's basically, crackers there. That's cow country, crackers. So a lot of them were being sent out. So they built about 50 buildings. They had their own newspaper called the Flamingo Sword. They were doing everything. And they would bring in, they had music and orchestra. They had a school. And people in the community would come and see music for the first time. And see an orchestra. They'd never seen an orchestra. And even the local kids would attend their school, as wacky as it is. So eventually got deeded to the state so once he died and he didn't resurrect, basically it started to fall apart and people started to leave. And then he didn't have a leader, so quarrels start, right? So people begin to leave. And then Hedwig Mitchell, who escaped Nazi Germany, came and lived there, and 4 of them lived right before they deeded to the state in 1961. And they were the last Koreshans. Of course, they'll say they live on forever. And so that's what ended up happening with that, is that it just basically, it lasted a long time compared to some of these others, like Rollstown. The Yamato colony. Everybody seen Yamato in Boca Raton? Just a few more here. 1903, Joe Sakai got his degree from New York University. He's from Japan. He's a Christian. And he is interested in bringing other Japanese Christians who are persecuted in Japan to bring and renew agricultural efforts in Florida, which were lagging. And the people in this Boca Raton area, Delray area, that's where it is, they were really excited because the Japanese are really great gardeners, right? They're great with agriculture, and they'll bring in new plants. new types of fruits and vegetables and new ways, new techniques. Well, when they end up getting here, when he brings in a lot of these young men, some 20 of them, and then about 50 families to this Yamato settlement, they basically just start growing whatever the other locals are growing. So that turned out to be a pretty disappointment, which was pineapples. Did you know Florida was the pineapple capital of the world? They grew tons and tons of pineapples in Volusia County as well. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So about 75 families came. They purchased the land. They got a land grant, purchased the land from James Ingram, who was the head of the Model Land Company, which is the real estate arm of the FEC. And they mainly grew pineapples and winter vegetables. 1,000 acres, mostly on small plots, 5, 10 acres type of thing. And there he is right there. In 1903, they renamed the post office and the rail station there, the depot there, where the truck farmers and your farmers can take to the FEC depot. There's one in Port Orange. It's one of the only ones left. They're going to be turning that into a museum in about 2 years. They're working on it now.
Good.
And so it was renamed Yamato, and it's the Yamato settlement. Yamato is an ancient name for Japan. It means harmony, basically. So that's what it. So he recruited a lot of other Christian Japanese because there was a lot of nationalism that was rising at the time. And if you were Christian, you were considered un-Japanese at that time, at the turn of the century. So he came here.
what town is Yamato?
Boca Raton. Boca Raton. It's in Boca Raton, and there's a Yamato Road. So they had this settlement there. They started shipping 10,000 crates of fruits, 20,000 crates of tomatoes, doing pretty good. Doing pretty good. But here's what happens. How many of you ever cashed in on real estate? So these Japanese guys, these families, the land boom is going crazy where people are paying $10,000 for swampland for an acre, and they cash in, a lot of the settlers cash in, and they either go to other cities or they go back to Japan. And then what ends up happening is World War II happens. And the settlers who are left there, their land gets commandeered by the United States government for an air base by eminent domain. And a lot of them, they were not interned into camps, but they were monitored. And so they were monitored for a while during World War II. One of them stayed. And that's George Murakami. How many of you have been to the George Murakami Museum? It is worth going down there on a weekend to see it. It is like nothing you've ever seen in Florida. They took natural Florida vegetation and made it into Japanese gardens. And I had heard about it a long time. I went and I was like, oh my, I was blown away. It's incredible. It is worth a trip to Boca Raton to spend the night to go to Murakami Museum. And this is just some of it you're looking at. That's Florida. That's not Japan. That's Florida. That's Boca Raton. Sandy high pine lane of Boca Raton. And George Murakami stayed. He never left. And he donated his land, I don't know, in the 1960s or 70s to the city, and they would turn it into a museum. The Melbourne Village. The Melbourne Village. So Melbourne Village. So yeah, West Melbourne was a Utopian society in Brevard County as well. Another back to the land movement that was based on kind of victory gardens. World War II. A very charismatic leader named Ralph Borsodi. He was one of these kind of socialist, back to the land, experimenting with the land, and independent communities that were self-sufficient. You know, you didn't need... A lot of this stuff is reactions against the industrial age and the urbanization, right? You get a lot of that. That's what the progressive era is. It's a reaction against the Industrial Revolution from 1865 to 1900. And then 1900 to 1920, you get the progressive movement. It's more about the common good, whereas the Industrial Revolution is more, and that Gilded Age or Victorian Age is more about, you know, the self-made man or the self-made person. We still like both those concepts. We try to juggle those today. He wrote books on self-sufficient living. He had this experiment called the Dayton Project in Dayton, Ohio. Before the war, it was very successful, self-sufficiency, and it kind of went under right when World War II happened. But there were followers, 3 women followers. Elizabeth Nutting, Margaret Hutchinson, and Virginia Wood had a dream of continuing to love and to promote Borsodi's ideals back to the land movement of self-sufficiency and co-ops, and basically kind of this socialist, almost quasi-communist type of settlement in West Melbourne, near the mall, if you've ever been out there. And so they were influenced by his teachings. They created a University of Melbourne. And again, you would buy a plot, and this is a great idea. They had like a little grocery store there, and it was all on the honor system. Ask me how well that did. No. You just go in, there's no clerk, there's nothing, you know. Didn't go. The general store, bad idea. If you ever see in our museum the Coca-Cola display, you see the early vending machines are just honor system, there's a reason they went to coin vending. Of course, the Great Depression was, a lot of these back to living movements happened in the Great Depression. So they had this association called the American Homestead Foundation, and you would buy this plot of land. The problem is it was expensive. So only middle and upper class people, or upper middle class people, could afford it. And so some say it was a way to keep black Americans out, because they didn't want them into the village. After the war, there was a problem with supplies, like nails and stuff, so they borrowed like Quonset huts and other building materials from the local air base from World War II, because there were 172 military institutions or bases in Florida during the war. And this is one of them. This is one of the historic buildings. That was a barracks. That was now the community center. It's still there today. I mean, you can go into this town today. And so they basically cleared all this land and were doing this back to the community, back to the land, through the American Homestead Foundation. And that's how you got it. And the three women were basically running it. The ones I just told you about. Oh, there's it. Okay. There's the end, and here's another failed utopian society, which is New Smyrna Beach, right? Of course, not anymore. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the talk today.